In today's video, I'm going to be touching on something a bit more controversial, the topic of censorship within the ME-CFS world, and more specifically, the censorship that some ME-CFS patients can actually impose onto other ME-CFS patients. Now, this is something that I have noticed, as someone who's been ill with this disease, with this illness for well over 7 years. I've noticed it crop up over and over again, that there are some topics, at least in some areas of the ME-CFS world, you just can't talk about them. And I find this problematic because for any movement, and I think it's fair enough to call the ME-CFS world a kind of movement, because the overall attempt or aim is, or at least should be, to get to a point where this disease is completely demystified and in which there are a range of treatments to help people dramatically improve or even recover. But unless a movement has the capacity to be self-critical and self-reflective, that can actually present a very significant stumbling block that can make it hard to reach those kinds of natural endpoints which we would hope would actually be what the overall endeavour is really about. And so in today's video, I'm going to be talking a bit more about this problem. But first, my name is Patrick Usher, and I'm author of the book Understanding ME-CFS and Strategies for Healing, in which I break down some of the latest, most exciting research into ME-CFS and long COVID, as well as talking about a range of healing strategies that I have tried in order to improve my own quality of life as an ME-CFS patient. You can find links for that book down below, as well as to a free sample chapter. I just mentioned my book. It's actually from something in relation to my book that sparked the idea for this video. Because the other day, I noticed that someone had posted about my book on the CFS Reddit group. The person in question, Tom Harris, who's an ME-CFS patient out in New Zealand, and he has a Substack that's very well worth checking out in relation to ME-CFS. He had done this short write-up of my book, and he'd been very positive about it, which was great to see. And I'll put a link down to his original Substack piece. But on that write-up, he had talked about the most important aspect of my book, the reason I wrote it, which is trying to explain the unifying model of ME-CFS put forward by Wirth and Scheibenbogen. And my book wasn't the only topic of his article. He was also talking about other ME-CFS news and sharing that with his followers on Substack. Anyway, so this was posted on the CFS Reddit, and it was actually taken down. And here were the reasons that were given. So the CFS mod team said, your post has been temporarily removed because it contains a link to a book that includes brain retraining content, which is against our subreddit rules. If you would like to edit your post to remove the book recommendation, we can reinstate it. Learn more about our brain retraining stance. My book, which is almost 450 pages long, contains one chapter on brain retraining. My chapter on brain retraining, as anyone who's read my book and as anyone who's followed my YouTube channel for a while will know, takes a rather different approach to most others on this topic. In particular, actually criticise quite strongly the typical ME-CFS brain retraining narrative. I'm strongly against anyone who reduces ME-CFS to just being a hypersensitive nervous system. I think that there are enormous issues both in terms of accuracy of understanding this disease and how it's communicated to people who are ill. I think there are ethical issues around what's going on, very big ethical issues in relation to the ME-CFS brain retraining typical narrative. I think that people are being misled. I think that it's so much more complicated than how it is being presented. I think that it's really dangerous because there's so much concrete research into ME-CFS, and patients have a right to know what's actually wrong with them. And so the way it's being presented at the moment, that it's all just a hypersensitive nervous system and that this exercise intolerance is just because your nervous system is freaking out because you want to go for a walk and so on. It's ludicrous scientifically, and it's actually dangerously misleading, particularly for patients who are more severe. So I'm very critical of that. On the other hand, there is scientific evidence to suggest, and there's plenty of anecdotal evidence to suggest, and also speaking from my own personal experience, there does seem to be a maladaptive neuroplastic state that is involved in ME-CFS, and which can be amenable to neuroplastic exercises. In other conditions, like post-stroke recovery, there can be a role for neuroplasticity. And I have myself benefited from exercises, most of which I've developed myself, and which I find can actually change some aspects of my autonomic dysfunction, like noise sensitivity or just the excess sympathetic state, and which can help me to have a better quality of life. And I actually believe personally, subject to more research and study, that the root cause of ME-CFS probably is in this maladaptive neuroplastic state. That's a personal belief. I also believe that ME-CFS, once it becomes ME-CFS, is far more than just that root cause, and that what you then get is a kind of illness of many vicious interlinking cycles that are affecting so many aspects of the body, which then become responsible for the exercise intolerance and post-exertional malaise, and which in and of themselves also tend to feed back into the brain function and further sensitize the nervous system. So it's very complicated. But to get back to censorship and my book being, banned on this Reddit group, reflect on this objectively. As I say, I have a 450-page book, of which one chapter of about 40 pages is discussing brain retraining. First half of that chapter is discussing the narrative in a very critical way, actually saying that the way it's being presented in a lot of popular ME-CFS spaces is very misleading and even dangerous. In that chapter, I talk about, how it can still be positive, but I do so in a way that's very cautious, very clear about what I'm discussing, that's anecdotal, very clear that it needs to be taken over as an area by scientists, by experts, who can actually come in and take this area out of the hands of people who at present are, in the main, not all, but in the main, are actually grossly misleading ME-CFS patients and gaining quite a substantial amount of money in the process. It needs to be taken out of their hands, and actually we need to have the scientists come in and say, these are the problems in the ME-CFS brain, this is the course we've designed to correct those dysfunctions, let's study this and see what happens. That's what my call to action, as it were, is in that chapter. When I talk about it in terms of my own experience, I'm very clear on the limitations of the effect of this on me, and I very much frame it as my own experience. And I should say that you might be watching this and thinking, well, Patrick, what you've described is quite reasonable, or at least I hope you think that. Maybe the moderators over there don't actually know what's in your book, but they do, because they read it, and they actually wrote to me and with a quite unpleasant email about the brain retraining chapter. Okay, so this has been my own recent experience with censorship in the ME-CFS world. What this whole incident tells me, I actually find it extraordinary, because I could partly maybe understand if I was saying, that ME-CFS is just a hypersensitive nervous system, ignoring all the research and just saying, come and buy my program for $5,000 or whatever. I could understand someone banning that, but to actually ban someone who's critical of that narrative and actually saying the scientists need to come in and make this robust, I actually find that extraordinary. It's basically saying that we can't talk about this topic at all. It's actually completely off the table from the perspective of these people. They're not interested, even though neuroplasticity is a valid option for many conditions. The very topic is clearly not to be discussed at all in relation to ME-CFS. And it's basically showing, a complete lack of curiosity about the experience of many ME-CFS patients, both positive, negative, and middling, with neuroplasticity. But if we are actually caring about the truth first and foremost, no topic is off the table. You have to be able to discuss everything in a rational and objective way, because that's how things move forward. And also, as a general approach to life, to actually allow people to make up their own minds. It's such an important thing that actually to trust people, to respect people's own inner world and decision-making process, to allow people to be exposed to ideas that they can then go away and actually think about for themselves. What this approach is doing is it's actually removing access of information to people, and it's removing perspectives, and it's removing what people, I think, most people are actually hungry for, which is knowledge and the exchanging of ideas. And actually one of the things which makes a life worth living, which is actually being exposed to a range of perspectives, many of which you might reject. But that process of actual learning and growing is crucial to a good life. So anyway, as I say, this is an example of censorship. It's happened in the case of my own book, but it's a very common one, which is any discussion of neuroplasticity is blocked or banned in certain spaces. People, ME-CFS patients who may have recovered from this, even from very severe situations, are not able to share that story with other patients If someone recovers from ME-CFS, they've been through an awful lot usually, and they may feel moved to actually try and help out people who are still struggling. And there is a huge value, as long as someone is not coming along and saying what I've done will work for everyone, there's a huge value in someone just saying this is what helped me. Like, people want to know that, and they should be able to have access to that, and again make up their own minds. The topic of brain retraining is an area where this censorship happens a lot, and it also happens within pro-brain retraining spaces, but just from a different angle, in that if people come along and say, hey, the illness is more complicated, or hey, I did this and it didn't work at all, or I actually got worse. In those cases, people are often kind of censored in other ways, like, oh, you haven't done it hard enough, or just keep trying, you'll get there eventually. And the more complicated nature of ME-CFS is in those areas not actually brought to the table. There's kind of problems from both sides of the divide.
This video is sponsored by Normalite. Now, I have been using Normalite for 3 years, and it is the most helpful supplement that I have found in managing my own condition. Like a lot of ME-CFS patients, I suffer with low blood volume, and Normalite is a highly effective strategy for combating this issue. It is a form of oral rehydration solution, and one study by Meadow et al. From 2019 found that this kind of formulation can boost blood volume as effectively as a saline IV. When I drink Normalite, I really notice the difference. I can feel the blood volume expanding throughout my body, my legs become lighter, my nervous system calms down. Even better is that Normalite has been specifically created for patients with illnesses like ME-CFS, long COVID and POTS. So check out the link below to order your own bags of Normalite. I personally enjoy the pure flavour, but it does come in a range of options.
Censorship in general, and it's not just brain retraining where this happens, there are other areas too in which there's censorship in the ME-CFS world. But what it speaks to, more generally, is a movement that is not comfortable with being self-critical or self-reflective. And as I said at the beginning of this video, that's a huge problem, because in order for any movement to make progress and actually reach a place where things are really different in a good way, in a positive way, the capacity to be self-critical and self-reflective is crucial. Otherwise things stagnate. The ME-CFS world don't seem to be setting out to ask. And they include questions like, what's the end game? What are we actually trying to move towards? Because at the moment, there's a lot of discussion about how terrible ME-CFS is, and that's fine. And then there's a lot of research that's coming out more and more and finding this part of the illness that's going wrong and this part that's going wrong. There's not such a huge sense about where we're trying to move towards at a big picture level. And I sometimes think that, although things will continue to make some level of progress, like, will we have actually moved on dramatically even 50 years from now if this current approach is maintained? Because what we're not asking is, where do we ultimately need to get to? And missing from that discussion is the acknowledgement. Ultimately ME-CFS has to become like, from the point of view of mainstream medicine and society, it has to actually become like any other significant illness, like multiple sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis. We need to get to a point where there is an agreed, roughly speaking, pathophysiology of the illness. This is why I'm personally so drawn to the Wirth and Scheibenbogen work. They're actually saying this is a unified model of ME-CFS. This is what makes ME-CFS no longer a collection of quote-unquote random problems. If ME-CFS is to make any sense as an illness, it's not random. It has to follow certain patterns. It has to be like any other disease. Now, of course, certain aspects of those patterns may be stronger in some patients than others. The overall severity may be different from different patients, but the actual disease process has to be essentially the same in everyone. Changes around the edges, different risk factors, and so on. But in essence, it's the same. And otherwise, you're not talking about an illness. You're not talking about ME-CFS. So one of the things that I think needs to be kind of thought about is, can we agree as an ME-CFS movement that we need to establish a big picture of what this illness is, and to give up the idea that it's going to be random stuff affecting different people in different ways. Instead, we need to have a unified model that can explain all the research together. But who's doing that? Very, very few people have made that effort over the years. And instead, we have silos operating. And so can we actually get to a point where we are able to actually think reflectively and constructively about what are the problems of the silosization of the research. Another issue is, can we actually talk much more optimistically about the possibility of recovering from this disease? Where are the studies which look at how people have recovered? There's been well over 11,000 papers into ME-CFS. How many of those are actually considering people who recover? How many of those are looking for, the patterns of how people recover? These studies, apart from individual case studies, they don't really exist. And that's very, very problematic. We should be looking not just at why people are getting sick and what's going wrong. We should also be asking ourselves, what are people doing to get better? Actually looking for the active ingredients in what people do to recover, because a lot of the typical narrative around ME-CFS is you don't recover. And there's also, in some areas, censorship of people who say they've recovered, no matter what the reason for their recovery. And that's also a very bad sign. We need to be able to talk about the positive possibilities and what that tells us about the nature of ME-CFS as well. And what it seems to me from the research is that ME-CFS, it's not like there is damage that goes on in the body. There is. It's not like motor neuron disease where, dramatically break down. It's horrendous, particularly if you're more severe. Can we actually talk about whether the body is still fighting for us with this disease and how we can actually encourage it in a better direction? There is a certain thought police aspect that is in the ME-CFS community which doesn't want to consider the possibility of improvement or even recovery. And that doesn't speak well of us either. As usual, I say to myself when I do these videos, keep it at 8 minutes, and here I am jabbering on almost 20 minutes later. But a few other things. Now that I've gone so long, I might as well continue. But a few other things. Where is the discussion on trying to find the cause? Where's the effort to actually sit down and say, what starts all this off? Where does it begin? I'm not seeing a lot of researchers doing that. I can't actually think of that are trying to say, this is what can then, the unifying model is essential, but where does it all start within that? And what does that tell us about where we should be putting our efforts in terms of trying to find ways to improve or even recover? My own personal belief, as I said earlier, is that the cause is in the brain. And I sometimes wonder, because topics around neuroplasticity are so suppressed, are we actually, having this knee-jerk reaction to wanting to think about the cause because maybe, yes, it actually is in the brain. And then people, including scientists, might start saying that, we should start thinking much more seriously about neuroplasticity and creating much more robust scientific interventions based on that. Would there be a pushback from within this kind of censorship dynamic which would say you can't go there? That's not science. In science, nothing is off the table. You have to be able to investigate everything. But I sometimes wonder, is that dynamic actually subtly or not so subtly pushing back and kind of preventing researchers from going in that direction? And finally, I've also noticed real problems around, when people come forward to try and say that they might have a therapeutic solution that could dramatically help people, there's a lot of pushback on that as well. And I've noticed this in relation to Professor Wirtz's mitodicure pill, which obviously we don't have the studies, but the rationale is there that it could really help people because it would be targeting something actually based on the pathophysiology, something that actually, in a much more targeted way than low-dose naltrexone, which is peripheral to the disease, something that actually could really get in at a key area of the disease and therefore help people more dramatically. But I have noticed when that kind of optimistic argument is made, a lot of people don't like it. And they don't, they have this knee-jerk reaction where they don't even want to support it. For me, it's obvious that, I'm not on team mitodicure, I'm on team we need scientific trials for mitodicure, because ultimately it's scientific truth that will do the talking in relation to that medication. A lot of people have this knee-jerk reaction where they don't want to back it to succeed. And it's very strange because a lot of these people are clamoring all the time, saying how awful it all is, and we need help. And yet I've noticed the same people respond in a very dismissive way to the only research group that is actually proposing what could be the world's first specifically approved medication for ME-CFS. And that's a problem. And again, it doesn't actually reflect well certain dynamics in the ME-CFS world. Of course, there's lots of ME-CFS patients who aren't of this kind of mindset at all, who believe in discussion and who believe the science should go wherever it needs to go and who believe in backing our strongest cards and hoping that they will succeed while recognizing that the scientific process is ultimately what decides that success or not. Of course, there's many people like that. But there are also these dynamics that are not helping us, which are keeping us back, which are keeping us in the dark. If we look through history, it's never the people who burn the books that are on the right side of it. And it's sad to see in relation to the ME-CFS world, where we really need much more discussion, much more listening to each other, much more curiosity and drive to really get to grips with this disease. It's actually sad to see that that dynamic is part of that world and it's actually slowing down progress, limiting our the overall effort to get to grips with what this disease involves, and to actually get to that stage where the millions of people worldwide finally, have a concrete explanation for their illness and concrete help in order to get better. That's it for this video. A more controversial one, much longer than I thought it would be, but I'll be interested in your thoughts. Feel free to take a different perspective. As I said, I believe in debate, I believe in discussion. As long as people aren't just, having a go at each other, but actually staying close to, discussing the issues, I think that's good. And please go and check out my newly launched Patreon Discord community, Treatments and Research Support Community, where we have a dedicated Discord server with lots of different channels to talk about sharing of research and treatment tips, and also Zoom calls once a month to kind of help each other move forward as a community. It's only $7 a month or €5.50. You can find the links down below. You can get the first week free as well. And that's it for this video. I will see you in the next one, when I'll be back talking about something more research based.